So not only is Dr. Tweeddale very intelligent, he's also very Scottish. I mean, we don't have more of a Scottish name than this, do we? Tweed and Dale. The Dale of Tweed. But he's also from the Berg.
Yeah.
So it's not actually a requirement that we always have a faculty member from Pittsburgh, but maybe we should.
It really
what
helps.
do you think? So we're just going to take a moment here. It's really a conversation. One of the things that we talk a lot about, actually, not just because it's our work, but because we also enjoy it, is just this topic of theological education and the role of theological education in the history of the church, the role of theological education in the life of the church today, the value of theological education. So really, we're just going to have a conversation out loud up here about theological education and what it means to us, what it meant in the past, what it means today, and how we can think about this topic of awakening it from the vantage point of theological education and what theological education has to say about it. But before we go any further, can I just commend you all? Do you not eat? This is dinner time. You do know that. So I just am amazed. Every year I am astonished. You sit here through lunch and dinner, and I just wonder if you people ever eat. But we're grateful that you're here. So, Dr. Tweeddale, it's nice to see you.
Good to be here.
Nice to have you on the stage. We'll say you're not trying out for a role as a bass singer in the barbershop quartet.
No.
You just have a little bit of a sore throat you're battling here.
That's right.
So we'll pray for you as you power through this.
Thank you.
But as you think back, what are some of the highlights as you just think back over the history of theological education in the life of the church?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, one of the forgotten legacies of the Reformation is theological education. So often when we think about the Reformation, we think about the work of individuals like Calvin and Luther, and yet we forget that they worked with an army of like-minded pastors and theologians who were committed to taking the Reformation and taking the gospel and taking the truth of God's word to the next generation. And so literally everywhere the Reformation took root, a concern for theological education emerged. And so when you think about the Reformation, understand churches were planted, books were published, confessions were written, but academies were established. So it goes to the very heart of the Reformation to ask the question, how are we going to train the next generation to surpass us in our love for God's word and our commitment to the truth of the gospel? And so one of the core ideas of the Reformation is that we're going to not only preach, not only establish churches, but we're going to establish academies.
You know, we think of the academy at Geneva. Maybe some of you have heard R.C. talk about this. He'll say, I don't even have to close my eyes, he would say. I just see it. And if you know the Great Wall, the Reformers' Wall there in Geneva, and if you look just past the wall, you see the blocks of the old city wall, but then you see the blocks that were Calvin's academy that he established there in Geneva. But it actually goes back to Strasbourg. When Calvin was exiled from Geneva, and he wanted to go to Strasbourg in the first place. He never wanted to stay at Geneva. And Guillaume Farel sort of tricked him, as it were, into staying in Geneva. And then Geneva kicks him out. And he gets to go to Strasbourg after all with Butzer. And there in Strasbourg, he ended up pastoring about 2 or 3 different congregations, French refugees mostly. But he ended up mostly then at one church. And just a few doors down from this church was his home, where he lived. And it was actually in his room, in his home, that he started the academy there at Strasbourg. He had the great university, but he started this academy. And so almost from the very beginning of Calvin, he had a vision for theological education. And then when he goes to Geneva, he founds the academy, which today is the University of Geneva.
That's right.
And it was founded by Calvin as an academy to train young men for the church, the service of the church. So you mentioned the Reformers. We talked about Calvin. Who are some of the other people in this history of theological education we should be talking about?
So to even pick up in the Genevan Academy,
Yes.
one of the refugees that were in Geneva is a guy named John Knox, a Scotsman, of course.
I knew you were going to bring in the Scots.
And so when John Knox leaves Geneva to go back to Edinburgh, he has a vision for theological education. And Knox actually says the virtuous education of the youth is essential for the advancement of Christ's kingdom. And so he goes back to Scotland with a passion for theological education. But what you see with Scots and Presbyterians in Scotland, you also see then with Puritans down in England. And so you think of a place like Cambridge that becomes a hotbed for Puritan training. You have somebody like William Perkins, who was a great popularizer of Reformed theology, who is teaching people at Cambridge as well as preaching God's word in the local church. And then as Puritans were leaving place like Cambridge, later in the century you have place like John Owen, who's at Oxford during the time of Oliver Cromwell. And he preaches a series of sermons to young students in order to help them engage theological errors that are being faced in England at the time. About this time as well, you have pilgrims going into the New World. You can move into the 18th century and think of Presbyterians at Princeton. So you can think of Puritans at Cambridge, Presbyterians at Princeton, and all the way back you've got Calvin and Reformers in Geneva. It's part of the history of the Reformation to see centers of theological education emerge.
So I'll throw a Scotsman into the mix who was at the University of Edinburgh, is Witherspoon.
That's right.
So Witherspoon is in Scotland. He's a graduate of University of Edinburgh.
Graduate of Edinburgh.
And I don't know if you know this, we're going to hear from Kevin DeYoung here soon. Kevin is actually working on his doctoral dissertation on John Witherspoon. And I heard him mention this quote at lunch. I'd never heard, you probably have heard this before. I've never heard this before, and I love this quote. But Witherspoon was thinking about whether or not to take the job at Princeton. And we've got to remember, Princeton was a cow pasture in the 18th century. And here he is in Scotland in these prestigious churches and universities, and he's wondering, should I go take this position at Princeton as president? And Whitefield says to Witherspoon, a gowned man is worth a legion. So what he means by that is you're going to so multiply your efforts if you go and invest in this theological education at Princeton in the 18th century.
It's beautiful.
And it's just a great line. This one student, just one, is like a legion that you had to influence. I had never heard that quote before.
I'd not heard that either.
And I love that quote. So that was a nice little nugget from Kevin. We pick up the story at Princeton with people like Charles Hodge. Then Hodge, of course, passes the mantle to Warfield. Warfield passes the mantle to Machen. So you want to elaborate any on that sort of trajectory there?
Well, one of the great things with Hodge, of course, is that he represents stability and fidelity. In one place in Princeton for about 50 years, he taught the lion's share of ministers in the United States in the late 19th century. He was committed to the work of theological education, to writing commentaries, to training men for ministry, and Princeton became a bastion for Reformed Presbyterian orthodoxy. And yet, as we move out of the 19th century and into the 20th century, the church is faced with controversies often surrounded with theological liberalism. And so John Gresham Machen, of course, founds Westminster Theological Seminary in order to prepare the church to fight against liberalism and encroaching liberalism in the church. And so he says he wants to create theological specialists. That is, godly men who are trained deeply in the truth of God's word to equip the people of God with the onslaught of liberalism.
You know, I think about this. I spent a lot of time with Machen. I did a book on Machen, spent a lot of time in the archives at Westminster Seminary on Machen. And I just so admire what Machen did. So here he is at Princeton and realizes that he's just kicking against the tide here. There's no way he can sort of turn the ship around. And he really takes on an absolutely monumental task of founding a seminary. And so he goes across the Delaware River, and he's of means. His father was fairly wealthy. His mother was even more wealthy. And so he has some means at his disposal. But still, the challenge of this, he goes across the river in Delaware and gets a brownstone, and there he opens the doors of Westminster Theological Seminary in 1929. Now, does anybody remember what happened in 1929 on Wall Street in 1929? And why does he do this? So he does this because he's recognizing that if you don't have the ministers properly trained, you will not have a pulpit where God's word is proclaimed, and you will not have a people who are fed. And this is why he does it. He specifically starts Westminster so that he can, even not seeing it in his day, but seeing the generations to come be served by theological education. And I think, of course, of our first president here when I think of this. But you've recently done some work on this. How do we connect the dots? Can we connect the dots from this Reformers, Princetonians, Machen to R.C. and what he was up to?
Well, one of Dr. Sproul's chief mentors was somebody by the name of John Gershner, who taught at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Gershner himself was actually taught by a student of Machen. But when you think about the importance of Westminster, a number of years ago at our 5-year anniversary for RBC, Dr. Sproul was reflecting on the contribution of Westminster Seminary, and he wanted to emphasize the importance of having a strategic center for theological education, that though small, can have a disproportionate influence on the entire church. And he said early in his ministry, he did a thought experiment where he listed about 100 key Reformed leaders, and he said 99 of them were taught at Westminster Seminary. And his point was a small place can have an enormous impact on the church. Well, one person that was impacted directly by Westminster Seminary was Dr. Gershner, who invested heavily in Dr. Sproul. And so when Dr. Sproul founds RBC in 2011, he very much has that model in mind. But whereas Machen wanted to found a seminary that focused on clergy and creating theological specialists, Dr. Sproul wants to focus an undergraduate college that focuses on creating theological generalists, raising up the next generation of Christian leaders who will not only serve churches, but serve in all kind of vocations.
Yeah. You know, when you think about this, in our building at the college, we have in the lobby the wooden sign from the Ligonier Valley Study Center. And I love it that, first of all, somebody thought when they moved from Orlando, or from Ligonier rather, to Orlando, that somebody thought to take the sign with them. So I love the forethought there. And then I love whoever had the idea to stick it up in our building. So I love this sign, but it reminds us, this is what RC was doing in 1971. And you know, one of the things that if you look at RC, you begin to discover two things very quickly. Number one is how formative college was on him. So he was converted as a freshman in college. He grew up in a Presbyterian church, but it was a liberal church. He said his pastor rewrote the catechism. And one of the catechism questions that his pastor wrote was, who is the greatest Christian who ever lived? And the answer is Albert Schweitzer. Vesta had the same catechism. You can ask her about. So, needless to say, this was not a theologically robust church. And so, he comes to college unconverted. He gets converted. He comes under another professor, Thomas Gregory, who has his master's from Westminster and his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and is a great influence on RC. There he's converted to historical theology, philosophy, gets captivated by Augustine's thinking. And it's also as a college student that he has that midnight walk that's memorialized there in the opening pages of the Holiness of God, where he has what he calls his second conversion. I mean, all of this happens in college. And he's married in college. He gets married as a junior. And that same year, the Pirates win the World Series. It was a great year. So I think that college students meant a great deal to him. Because his own life was so formed and shaped. I think of my college years and the mentors I had really did shape me in my thinking. And I think he just loved college students. I've heard him say this many times, I want their minds. I want their mind. Somebody's going to get their minds, and I want their minds. So we see all this coming in to RBC. As you think about, you're a churchman, and you're in the academy, but I know your heart's in the church. I know it is. Sort of put on your prophetic goggles here for a little bit. As you look ahead, what are some of the pressing needs for theological education for the church as we look ahead?
Well, in many ways, we don't need less theology, we need more theology. We need Christians who understand the consequences of truth. You just heard Dr. Lawson talk about the centrality of truth, and that truth has profound consequence for us as the people of God. Will we be a people who live out what we believe? Because what we believe about God governs everything in our lives. What we believe about ourselves, what we believe about our homes and our families and our friends, what we believe about God governs how we think about work and vocation and society, and what we believe about God governs what we think about church and mission and evangelism and eternity. All of those things need a robust theology. And so we can't fall into the trap of thinking that theology is simply for an educated clergy or just simply for academic professionals. No, theology is for the people of God. And so as we exist at RBC, we want to emphasize that we teach theology for life, because knowing God is vital for all aspects of life.
You know, as I was thinking about this as we're trying to both recognize what we have, we've really been entrusted with an incredible thing. I think of this in Deuteronomy chapter 6 it's a powerful image of drinking at wells we did not dig, and eating from vineyards that we did not plant, and even living in houses that we did not build. And it's just such a reminder of our debt to those who have gone before. We drink at wells every day where we work that we didn't dig. And if we were to have those folks that we would look to, they would say, well, no, we drank from wells that we did not dig. And they drank from wells they did not dig. What we're talking about here with theological education, we're really going back to 2 Timothy. That's right. We're going back to Paul with his dearly beloved Timothy. And he says to Timothy that, I've poured my life into you, I've trained you, and now you have an obligation. So you need to now teach faithful men. And then they will teach others also. And Paul really sets up there a true succession plan that is a guardian of the deposit of faith, what the early church called the depositum fidei, the gospel. Sound doctrine is what we're talking about. And so we see it so beautifully there in what Paul's doing. And the reality is that's where we find ourselves.
Yeah. So there's a real sense then, Dr. Sproul said that everyone's a theologian.
He did.
We can also say that everyone is a theological educator, in that it's an incumbent upon every Christian that we tell others the good news of Jesus Christ. And so as Christians, we're always going to have somebody above us who is teaching us God's Word. We're going to have those who are beside us, friends that are spurring us on to greater love and good deeds.
Yeah.
But then there needs to be others who are under us or behind us that we're urging on and instructing. So whether you're 6 years old and you're working with your friends or your younger brother or sister, whether you're 16 or 66 or 96, you are a discipler. You are a theological educator. And so for this reason, we want to say that theology is a means of discipleship. And so we want to see every Christian from this perspective engaged in theological education.
Yeah. You know, when you think about this, ultimately theology is knowing God. And the more we know God, the more we love God. And the more we love God, the more we trust God, the more we obey God. And ultimately, this all results in the worship of God. You know, you go back to, there's something about this trajectory, and we could trace it back prior to the Reformers. We could go back to Augustine. We could go back to Thomas Aquinas. We could go back to Anselm. They all had students. They had the pastors under their care that they were in charge of. We could go to the Reformers. We could go to people like Turretin. We could go to the Princetonians. They all pretty much had the exact same doctrine of God. And they all almost to a T started there. We start with this, who God is, and theology is really the greatest thing we can do. Right. It truly is just a delightful thing because we get to study God. We get to just immerse ourselves in His Word and in His world so that we can learn about Him. Yeah. And all of them lead to worship. It was Aquinas, right, who said that theology is taught by God. So it's revelation, it's a top-down, taught by God. Theology teaches about God. So the content is God. He is both the subject and the object. He is both the author and the content. But then his last thing has always struck me, it leads to God. And he meant by that in worship. Right. It's doxological. And I know NRC would say this. Ultimately, theology is doxology and leads us to worship God. And I think that's why it's so crucial. And so you begin to look at these people who've had an impact on the church. You look at these Mount Everests of church history. And they're not operating out of a vacuum. They have spent time studying God's Word and studying theology. You know, I mentioned this to you. We were sitting here just before the break, and I said, you know, RC, of course, he was able to talk about Roman Catholicism, justification by faith, and he'd almost make it look effortless. You know, remember how he would do that and stand here and just make it look effortless? But there was a lot of work that went into that. And he had an entire course in seminary with John Gershner on the canons and decrees of the Council of Trent. They had a textbook that was the Latin text, the English text. And the whole semester, they went line by line by line by line through the canons and decrees of the Council of Trent. And I've seen his book. It's barely holding together. Right. It's got tape on the binding to hold it together, and it's just full of margin notes. And so we look at these folks, and we see that underlying that's quite a foundation of theological education. And God uses that to edify His people and to build His church and bring about His kingdom. And it's just a delightful thing to be a part of. So, well, I know you've given your life to the church and now to theological education, and grateful for your service there at the college. And I know many of you have supported us in our work there and what we're doing at the college. And I hope you hear what our heartbeat is, that ultimately our heartbeat is for this next generation to be so well grounded in theology that it just courses through their veins and just comes out of their fingertips as they serve the world and serve the culture and serve the church ultimately in proclaiming the gospel. So I'll tell you, you did pretty well. Despite your trying out for the bass part here in the Barbershop Quartet. So, and I want to say thank you to all of you for being here for this. Thank you. That's great. Thanks.